Sri Lanka, a paradise island known for its pristine beaches and ancient Buddhist temples. But beneath this idyllic facade lies a dark undercurrent of religious extremism that's tearing the nation apart. In this video, we expose the shocking rise of militant Buddhist groups and their violent campaign against minorities. You'll witness firsthand the devastating consequences of unchecked nationalism in a country once celebrated for its diversity. Sri Lanka's Buddhist heritage stretches back over 2 millennia, shaping the island's cultural landscape. Ancient stupas and ornate temples dot the countryside, testament to the deep-rooted influence of Buddhism. For centuries, Sri Lanka has been a tapestry of diverse religions and ethnicities, with Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians coexisting in relative harmony. But in recent years, this delicate balance has been upset by mounting economic pressures. The country has grappled with soaring inflation, dwindling foreign reserves, and a crippling debt crisis. As living costs skyrocketed and job opportunities dwindled, many Sri Lankans found themselves struggling to make ends meet. It's against this backdrop of economic uncertainty that we've witnessed the rise of extremist Buddhist groups. The most prominent among them is Bodhu Bala Sena, BBS, or Buddhist Power Force. Founded in 2012, BBS claims to protect Sri Lanka's Buddhist character from perceived threats from minority groups. As economic anxieties grew, so did the appeal of nationalist rhetoric. BBS and similar organizations capitalized on these fears, framing minorities, particularly Muslims, as threats to Buddhist culture and economic prosperity. They've accused Muslim businesses of unfair practices and claimed that the Muslim population is growing too rapidly. This marks a troubling transformation of Buddhist ideology in Sri Lanka. Traditionally a religion of peace and compassion, some interpretations now justify intolerance and even violence in the name of protecting Buddhism. Monks, once symbols of serenity, have become firebrand speakers at nationalist rallies. The consequences of this unchecked extremism soon became apparent. Reports emerged of raids on Muslim-owned shops and restaurants. Anti-minority protests grew larger and more frequent, with some turning violent. In one particularly chilling incident, a Muslim-owned clothing store was attacked by a mob, resulting in significant property damage and heightened community tensions. These events marked a dangerous escalation, setting the stage for even more severe outbursts of violence. As we'll see, the simmering tensions were about to boil over, leading to one of the darkest chapters in Sri Lanka's recent history. Imagine a town where Buddhists and Muslims live side by side for generations. Now picture that same town engulfed in flames, its streets echoing with screams and the crackle of burning buildings. This was the reality of Aluthgama in June 2014. What sparked this sudden descent into chaos, and why were authorities powerless to stop it? Aluthgama, a coastal town in southwestern Sri Lanka, was once a symbol of religious harmony. Muslims and Buddhists had coexisted peacefully for years, but beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. The rise of Buddhist nationalist groups like Bodhu Bala Sena, BBS, had been stoking anti-Muslim sentiment across the country. On June 15, 2014, these simmering tensions reached a boiling point. BBS organized an anti-Muslim rally in a predominantly Muslim area of Aluthgama. As hardline Buddhist monks delivered inflammatory speeches, the atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. What happened next would shock the nation and leave an indelible mark on Sri Lanka's history. Violence erupted suddenly and spread like wildfire through the town. Mobs attacked Muslim homes and businesses, setting them ablaze. The scenes were horrifying. Families fled for their lives, seeking refuge in schools as their homes were reduced to ashes. The police, caught off guard by the scale and ferocity of the violence, struggled to maintain control. Eyewitnesses described scenes of absolute chaos. One resident recounted cowering in a school with dozens of other families, listening to the sounds of destruction outside. The air was thick with smoke and fear, as people wondered if they would survive the night. As dawn broke, the full extent of the damage became clear. 3 people had lost their lives in the violence. Countless homes and businesses lay in ruins. Their charred remains a stark testament to the destructive power of hatred. The Muslim community, which had called Aluthgama home for generations, now found itself displaced and traumatized. The government's response was swift but ultimately inadequate. A state of emergency was declared, but for many in the Muslim community, it was too little, too late. They felt abandoned by the authorities who had failed to protect them and bring the perpetrators to justice. As Sri Lanka grappled with religious tensions, a different kind of predator was circling its most vulnerable citizens. Imagine taking out a small loan to start a business, only to find yourself trapped in a cycle of debt so vicious it drives people to suicide. This is the reality of microfinance gone wrong in Sri Lanka, a cautionary tale of how a noble idea became a nightmare for the poor. Microfinance entered Sri Lanka with the promise of lifting people out of poverty. The concept was simple: provide small loans to those who couldn't access traditional banking services, allowing them to start businesses and improve their lives. At first, it seemed like a beacon of hope for many struggling Sri Lankans. But over time, the landscape of microfinance in Sri Lanka changed dramatically. What started as a charitable endeavor morphed into a profit-driven industry. The numbers tell a shocking story. From 2006 to 2020, the total amount of microfinance loans in Sri Lanka skyrocketed from a modest sum to over $3.2 billion. This explosive growth came at a terrible cost to borrowers. As the industry expanded, so did its aggressive lending practices. Loan officers began pressuring people to take on debt they couldn't afford. Interest rates soared as high as 35%, trapping borrowers in a cycle of ever-increasing debt. Many found themselves taking out new loans just to repay old ones, sinking deeper into financial quicksand. The human toll of this predatory lending is devastating. Take the case of Maduka Kumari, a mother of 5. Overwhelmed by debt and hounded by loan officers from LOLC Finance, one of Sri Lanka's largest micro-lenders, Kumari attempted suicide. Her story is tragically common. Across the country, borrowers faced with impossible debts have taken their own lives, leaving behind grieving families and unanswered questions. The government's response has been insufficient. A debt write-off for 75,000 women in drought-affected areas came too late for many. Meanwhile, companies like LOLC Finance continue to profit, having received over $500 million in loans and guarantees from development banks. In a country once celebrated for its religious diversity, Sri Lanka now grapples with a fractured social landscape. The scars of the Aluthgama riots have barely healed, and new wounds threaten to tear the nation apart. What happens when a society pushed to its financial breaking point faces the resurgence of age-old religious tensions? The answer may surprise you, and it's reshaping the very fabric of Sri Lankan life. Today, tensions between religious communities simmer just beneath the surface. Buddhist hardliners continue to view minorities, especially Muslims, with suspicion. Meanwhile, minority groups live in fear of further attacks, their sense of belonging in their own country shaken to the core. This climate of mistrust has eroded the social cohesion that once defined Sri Lankan society. Moderate Buddhists and minorities face significant challenges in this polarized environment. Take the case of Reverend Wathareka Vijitha Thero, a Buddhist monk who dared to advocate for cooperation between Buddhists and Muslims. His reward: abduction and forced circumcision, a chilling message to those who speak out against extremism. This incident highlights the dangers faced by those seeking to bridge the divides in Sri Lankan society. Economic pressures continue to fuel extremism, creating a vicious cycle. As financial hardships mount, some find it easier to blame minority groups for their woes, further entrenching nationalist sentiments. The government's efforts to address these issues have been hampered by pushback from nationalist factions within the ruling party itself, complicating attempts at reconciliation. Yet amidst the chaos, glimmers of hope emerge. Civil society groups are actively working towards reconciliation between religious communities. Interfaith dialogues and community-building projects aim to foster understanding and cooperation among different ethnic and religious groups. These grassroots efforts, while facing an uphill battle, represent a crucial step towards healing Sri Lanka's fractured society. One unexpected source of unity comes from an unlikely place: landmine clearance efforts. Women involved in demining not only address the physical remnants of conflict, but also foster community resilience and cooperation. Their work serves as a powerful example of how shared challenges can bring people together, transcending religious and ethnic boundaries. Sri Lanka's recent history paints a sobering picture of how economic pressures can fuel religious extremism and fracture society. We've seen how the rise of Buddhist nationalist groups, coupled with a struggling economy, led to violent outbursts like the Aluthgama riots. The dark side of microfinance added another layer of stress, pushing vulnerable citizens to the brink. These complex issues have left Sri Lanka's social fabric in tatters. Minority groups live in fear, while moderate voices face intimidation. Yet there's hope in grassroots efforts for reconciliation and unexpected sources of unity like demining projects. For Sri Lanka to heal, it must address both its economic woes and social divisions. But this challenge extends beyond its borders. As we look at Sri Lanka's struggles, we're left wondering, how can diverse societies worldwide maintain religious harmony in the face of economic hardship and rising nationalism?